Hello, welcome everyone to a special edition of AI Reset to Zero, the video edition. You're watching this on YouTube or on my Substack. We have a special show for you today. I have as a guest today with me my nephew, Neal Makwana, who just graduated with his master's in computer science and business from UT Austin. He and I have shared a love for technology, for product, for design, for UX. Neal is far more proficient than me in the field of design aesthetics and product design, etc. So I thought it'd be useful to talk about the world of AI as it is evolving over the next few years, particularly because of a presentation, a 30-minute presentation that OpenAI founder, CEO Sam Altman did at a VC firm Sequoia's conference called AI Ascent a few days ago. He made comments on several topics that we're going to go over on the show. The most important that caught my ears was this observation that AI today, whether it's OpenAI or other product from other companies, are used fundamentally differently, as one would expect, by the younger generation than the older generation. And the conversation goes into this a fair bit on that video presentation by Sam. We thought we'd play for you a couple of minutes of that commentary and then discuss the implications of this, especially from the perspective of a freshly minted graduate of computer science and design and business from UT Austin, and how that generation really deals with all this AI stuff. So Neal, welcome to the show. And
Thank you. Happy to be here.
no, this is going to be fun. And please, it'll be a couple of minutes. Here's Sam talking about this issue.
I mean, this happens to people too. Like watching like someone who started. Maybe you like talk to an average 20-year-old and watch how they use ChatGPT, and then you go talk to like an average 35-year-old and how they use it or some other service, and like the difference is unbelievable. It reminds me of like, when the smartphone came out. And like every kid was able to use it super well, and older people just like took like 3 years to figure out how to do basic stuff. And then of course people integrate, but the sort of like generational divide on AI tools right now is crazy, and I think companies are just another symptom of that.
Anybody else have a question?
Just to follow up on that, what are the cool use cases that you're seeing young people using with ChatGPT that might surprise us?
They really do use it like an operating system. They have like complex ways to set it up to connect it to like a bunch of files, and they have like fairly complex prompts memorized in their head, or like, in something where they paste in and out. And that stuff I think is all cool and impressive. And there's this other thing where like they don't really make life decisions without asking like ChatGPT what they should do. And it has like the full context on every person in their life and what they've talked about. And, the memory thing has been a real change there. But yeah, I think it gross oversimplification, but like older people use ChatGPT as a Google replacement. Maybe people in their 20s and 30s use it as like a life advisor something. And then like people in college use it as an operating system.
So Neal, it looks like we boomers or older folks really don't have a clue what this AI thing is supposed to be used at, this operating system business. Is Gen Z, help us. Tell us a little bit about it from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting what he touched upon. I think me at 23 and, a lot of friends my age, we're all kind of at this interesting stage of life where we're kind of in between, we're just out of school, or we're trying to, finish up our degrees and whatnot. And we're trying to make sense of careers, relationships, finance, health and fitness and whatever. And it's kind of all happening at once. And yeah, it's kind of like what Sam touched on, is where ChatGPT has kind of become this like search engine, or it's kind of a life layer of operating where we're interacting with it, whether it's like writing resumes or cover letters for job applications, or trying to, plan workouts or like meal plans, or even stuff like I have friends who are just now getting their first like bonuses or whatever for jobs they're about to start, and they're trying to figure out how they want to allocate funds for investing and 401k advice and stuff like that. I think it's kind of this interesting shift where like Google was kind of about giving you answers, but ChatGPT or a lot of these AI platforms are kind of about giving you direction almost. It's kind of an interesting shift where like we're outsourcing like a lot of our decision making to this like platform that really didn't exist a few years ago, and it's where a lot of people are kind of using it to lean on it a bit more. I think something interesting, I was talking to a friend the other day, and they're talking about how they use TikTok as like a search engine. I think it's kind of interesting how people are going to these platforms and using them in unconventional ways. Whereas, earlier on Google, you might search like what's the best restaurant in Austin or whatever. Now people are going to like TikTok essentially to kind of get their advice, just because the algorithm's great. It's on the video format, so it's a little easier to understand what they're saying. But I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting how it's a lot more like customized. Obviously, kind of Sam talked upon how it has your whole like life history with this whole memory feature that they've added, and I think that's kind of what makes it such like a natural plugin to most people's lives. But yeah, I think it's kind of replaced for a lot of people, for good or the bad. I think that's kind of a different conversation, but how people are honestly going to ChatGPT more than they would go to like a friend or a family member to kind of get advice, whether it be anecdotal advice or just kind of life advice in general. But yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting shift in the way people are using stuff.
That's very helpful to understand. I mean, it's very different. Most of us on the older side of the equation, there's a bigger issue on this side of the generation gap with trust, privacy, etc. And it feels like your peers basically are jumping into this. You talked about memory. Memory is a pretty recent phenomenon in these products. OpenAI has done some initiatives, Anthropic, others. In fact, my first post 22 posts ago, almost 2 years ago, was about the fact that AI systems don't have any memory. They don't know who you are. It's almost like finding Nemo in terms of the fish. And obviously, they're getting a lot better. Sam is very focused on this. If people watch this whole 30 minutes, he talks a lot about the memory piece. But I want to talk about this trust privacy piece. Your generation, your peers, it feels like you guys have been just trusting of all of this far, far more and far deeper and far longer than we on this side of the divide. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that just natural because your world is, I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Talk to us a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
mean,
about how you guys think about trust and privacy.
I think it is kind of like a generational thing. Sam kind of touched on it here, but there's like kids who are getting phones in their hands at like age like 5 almost, and they really don't know any better, to where they're kind of using this from the get-go, and they're kind of so used to leaning on it to just, well, I mean, obviously at a younger age, you're not giving any information up willingly. You're mostly just playing games or watching videos and stuff. But I think it kind of builds this trust where it almost replaces, not replaces a human, but it kind of, it's hard to discern in ways, if this thing is something you're interacting with for information, or if you're just trying to learn more about other things. So I think intrinsically and just like by default, people don't think as much. I guess in my generation, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think on the privacy piece, it's kind of like, everyone's information is kind of out there to some extent. So might as well kind of lean on these platforms to get as much out of it as you can, from advice, from help with school, finances, work, health, rather than kind of focusing as much on the privacy piece. As I said, that might, obviously that's not like a blanket statement. I think everyone has very strong views on the privacy piece, and I think it is very important, obviously, that all this stuff is being encrypted properly and all that. Obviously, I know they're using it to train models and stuff, but there's even a way. I mean, I do know people that whenever they are asking certain life advice or whatever it might be, turn on a temporary chat. Chat has this feature where you can kind of flip it on, and it won't, they say it won't be used to train any of their data. It won't be saved
Incognito mode.
in memory. But yeah, so it essentially replaces, what people are used to on a browser for incognito, but on chat. So I think, I've done this at times where like, I might be doing like schoolwork, and then if there is something where I need to maybe get help on something that is not school related or academics related, I'll turn on a temporary chat. Also, just because there's this habit that chat has a lot, where it'll bias its responses based on what you just most recently talked about. So even if what you're asking has nothing to do with what you were asking previously, it'll still bleed in some of those responses and try and force in parts of information that you've recently given it. So I think it's a good way to kind of like section off. And in the future, I know we'll kind of talk about the whole UI UX of this in a bit on one of the later clips. So I think it'll be interesting to see what they're doing to like maybe create these separate profiles within chat to where you can kind of have this, it's almost like this agentic platform where you can have an agent for finance, you can have an agent for school, you can have an agent for health, to where it's a little bit more siloed off. Yeah, I think that'd be kind of be an interesting shift on the privacy piece as well.
So that's very interesting. That's kind of like the Windows and Apple Mac basically creating these focus modes or workspaces where you can jump from one phase of your life to the other. Those are all bells and whistles that can be imagined. In fact, all of the companies, OpenAI and Perplexity and others, are actively have hinted that they're working on browsers that are essentially AI generated, and one can imagine these features in them. Let me ask you this other piece, since we're talking about against this generation thing. As you transition from school to the work environment, et cetera, one of the biggest issues over the last 2 or 3 years is, again, generational within the school environment and potentially in the work environment, especially at non-tech companies, is that older people, the professors and schools, have been generally reluctant for students to be using these technologies, cheating, etc. We've seen Chegg go down 80-90%. I've written a couple of posts about that. We'll put it up in the show notes. But and similarly, the recent surveys show that in workplaces, the bosses are basically not entirely sure what to make of younger people at the company using AI, how to grade that work, how to rate that work, etc. And that's an evolutionary thing as these technologies get better and go into reasoning better and agentic better. So it'll sort itself out over time. However, it'd be curious to understand your perspective and your peers' perspective, both from your experience at schools to date, and then a number of your friends are obviously working already, and you're about to start on that journey. What
Yeah.
your take is on that?
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. I was actually talking to a friend yesterday when we were hanging out about, so he's a TA for a couple of classes that I took during my undergrad, and these are classes like algorithms, like
Teaching assistant, just for those
yes,
who've been away from school for a
yeah,
while.
teaching assistant, exactly. Yeah. So I forget, like, good to highlight that. But yeah, so I mean, they're TAing these classes like data structures, like algorithms, these like really fundamental, like low level classes that kind of teach you these foundations upon which, a lot of these programming languages are based on. And I kind of asked him, I was like, having been through these classes, having taken the test, done the assignments, are you guys doing anything to kind of stop or prevent the use of AI? And he was kind of like, in the beginning, we were, but now the professors have kind of just given up entirely just because of the fact that it is really, really hard to avoid it because these models are getting so good. But you kind of put it in the way that, like, for assignments and all, it's kind of free reign. We all know everyone's going to use it, but to kind of balance it out, they do make the exams a lot harder. So the professors are intentionally making really complex questions where an AI might hallucinate and whatnot. I mean, even an experience I had recently in my program was we had a class, and the exam was, it was an online exam, but we were allowed to use ChatGPT. What the professor did is he literally put white text within the question itself to where if you were to copy paste it and put it into ChatGPT and not really know what you were doing, the white text would be telling you the opposite of what the question tells you. So in the white text,
Clever.
it would literally say, like, change this value to this, or like disregard this part of the question. And I know a lot of people who were tripped up by that. But there are, like, it's kind of interesting where, like, the professors are actually trying to play games to kind of see how attentive people are even when they're using these AI platforms. So from that point of view, from the school academics point of view, I think that's kind of where the standpoint is it's they are still trying to figure everything out. From the work standpoint, I haven't really talked to too many people, but from what I understand, I do have a friend who's doing some like research lab work here at UT, and I was just talking to him the other day, and he was like, he has to code in Python, and he says he tries to use ChatGPT more as like a replacement for Stack Overflow, so kind of like to learn syntax or how to do things you may not know how to do. But he said there have been people older than him in grad programs, and you can tell very easily that they are cutting and pasting from ChatGPT, and it kind of messes up their whole repository just because of the fact that, you're obviously trying to get this work done fast, but you also want to make sure it's interpretable and it's not just like a mishmash of AI prompts that are kind of just being fed into your code base. As far as the work, I guess, environment goes, I think it really depends on the company. I know some people that are working at smaller companies where the use of these platforms are kind of almost encouraged just because they know it's going to speed up productivity and output of work. But at bigger companies, obviously, they're a little bit more sensitive to what information is being shared. I know a lot of companies have internal tools and internal AIs that they use. So I feel like, yeah, it's just a very interesting landscape, and it's going to be very cool to see how they kind of figure this out in the next few years.
And since you're talking about various platforms, one question that's often on the mind, especially from people like me and my peers who are obsessed with how this stuff is being used to think about investments, whether it's startups, public companies, private companies, we're obsessed with market share of ChatGPT versus Anthropic versus Google. Will Google get crunched as AI search comes into the picture? I'd be curious your perspective again from your friends anecdotally, otherwise in terms of those kinds of trends. So one, which search engines are generally most favored? Do you guys tend to use one and stay with it, or multiple and jump around? And then the Google versus AI question as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think ChatGPT is still the front runner for most people. I think whether that's like an exposure thing to where
Sam, you
this,
listening?
yeah, to where people may not even be as aware of these like new. I mean, even stuff like Claude. I mean, I'm sure there's people I could bring up Claude to who may not actually know what it is, just because ChatGPT is kind of like how Google became, a verb that I'm gonna kind of Google this, rather than like search it. I'm gonna chat this. It's kind of just become like the base saying of kind of just using these AIs, which is kind of a testament to how big it's become. But I think chat's by far the most used one in my circles academically, and even for like when people go to it just for like personal advice or whatever. I do know that some people have subscriptions to Claude and they'll use it kind of as a fallback if the chat servers are being overloaded, if they run out of tokens. It's being used more of a backup. Some people I do know that use Claude as their primary, whether it's like for code and whatnot. But interestingly enough, I haven't heard a single person that I know that uses Gemini for anything.
Interesting.
Gemini, other than just like the whole like generative search stuff, like Google's added in the last year or so, where whenever you do a search, it'll give you a summary at the top. I don't know anyone that actually goes to Gemini as like a chat interface and actually asks the question. I don't know if that's like an anecdotal thing or if that's like a general trend, but I think by far it's ChatGPT, Anthropic, Claude, and then Gemini is like below
Well,
everything.
it's great to hear that, not for Google, but you probably saw Eddie Q from Apple hit the bombshell in the middle of the Google antitrust case, where he said last month in April, for the first time since Google is a default on Apple platforms, Safari, etc., they saw a drop in search through the Apple platforms. And this may be an anecdotal example of that, because
Yeah.
we're end of the school cycle. Graduation was upon us. Kids are using this stuff. Maybe that was a part of it. Interesting data point to just think about. And then the last question along those lines is, again, younger people. Right now, all of these companies are basically, everyone wants to charge $20, $200. In the case of OpenAI, they're contemplating price points higher for enterprise use, etc. So one of the things is just price sensitivity for your generation, obviously for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
How do you guys think about that? And if you had to
Yeah,
subscribe, which ones do you subscribe to? Again, anecdotally in your peers
yeah,
group.
it's funny you mentioned that. It's because a lot of people, as I said, didn't really use ChatGPT until like the last year or so, even though it's kind of been around for a bit longer. And actually, right when the semester ended a few days ago, everyone was sending around text saying, don't forget to cancel your $20 a month, because people, as I said, like some people lean on it for personal things and some people don't at all. So I think the people who just adopted it recently or were only purely using it for school, and now it's $20 less that they have to spend each month. It does kind of replace what Chegg used to be for most people, because I know plenty of people who would have Chegg accounts or share Chegg accounts. But yeah, I think as far as like the 200, I think I maybe know one person that's spent the
I'm surprised there was
$200.
one.
Yeah,
I
it's
hope
yeah, it's
their parents know.
yeah, I know. It's yeah, it was a very interesting decision because I didn't really understand how you can make use of that. But yeah, for me, it's just $20 for chat. I haven't canceled it. I still have it. Because I'm just obviously I'm using it for like job search stuff or for resume advice and stuff like that. But yeah, it is interesting that people, at least in my circles right now in my grad program that just came out of, are like fully canceling it because there really is no use. Also, just because the base models have gotten so much better than what they used to be. And maybe if you asked this question a year ago, some people would still need to pay the 20 to even get like a competent response.
Got it. By the way, since you mentioned that, I'm proud of my nephew. Amongst the top of his class, he is very specifically looking for roles in product management at tech companies, small, medium, large. If anyone out there, please ping him or ping me. We'll put you in touch. You can't go wrong. But just continuing on our discussion, so this I think has been an interesting discussion on the generational piece. There are three more clips I'd like to just touch on this video. And again, there's a lot here for people to digest. So I recommend watching the whole thing. But the other aspect is something, Neal, you and I talked a lot about, is where is UI, the user interface for AI going? Obviously, the industry's been very focused on chat as a mode. Agents are being talked about right now. People are getting used to slower reasoning models where we're going to be more patient while it thinks through our problems and questions. And the big thing everyone's excited about is voice, being able to talk to these things and so on. And all of this is interesting because you and I have talked about, Neal is a very long-time fan of Johnny Ive, the senior designer at Apple. And Johnny Ive, who's now got his own company form, and he's actually working with OpenAI on next generation AI devices. But he's famous for having said there have been in the history of computing over the last 40, 50 years, there have been essentially three UIs. The text terminal business, which is what it started. And today, a lot of programmers, developers like Neal do every day, day in, day out. Second is the graphical user interface. The third is the touch interface that we got with the iPhone in 2007 and Android, etc. And now everyone's saying there's this voice thing. But Sam had an interesting take on voice and GUIs, which I think we should play for a couple of minutes and then discuss afterwards.
Few questions. The first is how important is voice to OpenAI in terms of like stack ranking for infrastructure? And can you share a little bit about how you think it'll show up in the product and ChatGPT, the core thing?
I think voice is extremely important. Honestly, we have not made a good enough voice product yet. That's fine. Like, it took us a while to make a good enough text model too. We will crack that code eventually, and when we do, I think a lot of people are going to want to use voice interaction a lot more. I am super. When we first launched our current voice mode, the thing that was most interesting to me was it was a new stream on top of like the touch interface, and you could talk and be like clicking around on your phone at the same time. And I continue to think there's something amazing to do about like voice plus GUI interaction that we have not cracked. But before that, we'll just make voice really great. And when we do, I think there's not only is it cool with existing devices, but I sort of think voice will enable a totally new class of devices if you can make it feel like truly human level voice.
Yeah, so I feel like there's a lot of things to unpack from there. I don't know if you want to start off.
No, I think this is a fascinating point, and this, for a lot of OpenAI and industry watchers, this is as strong a clue as we can get in terms of what these companies are thinking about in terms of the evolution of the interface. And I couldn't agree with this more, as I'm sure anyone who's used voice by itself doesn't do it. It doesn't cut it. Oftentimes we need to do voice and GUIs together, and that is not yet there. As an ardent user of ChatGPT on the voice side, it's been very frustrating of late, and I'm sure Sam and his crew know this, and as same thing at Perplexity and Anthropic, etc., which is that you ask for things, it does lists, it does all this text, it can't send it to you, it can't email it to you, can't text it to you, can't put it in. Now that is changing. Google especially has an inside track at fusing it into Google Docs, etc. In fact, we may, just as an aside, Google has their big annual I/O conference next week, and the word is that they're going to have a lot of Gemini features. This may very well be one of those things. It's integration of voice and GUIs, but I think it's one of these obvious ideas, but at the same time, very deep ideas, because it's a fundamental reinvention. And there's going to be both an add-on nature of this and an AI native version of this. So I'd love to get your thought, because you are the next generation of GUI, you are user interface, experience person. So give us your take on what you just said.
Yeah, I guess there's like two points I wanted to touch on. One, just being like the social norms that exist, and I think how people my age are a little averse to the voice piece, just because of the fact that the only time I ever see people using voice is in their cars. Because you're not in a social setting, you're just with one or two people, and it's most of a hands-free type of experience. It's very rare that I'll see someone in a public setting, in a study room, in a coffee shop, pull out their phone and, use voice, just because it is like a social, you're with people, you don't want to just be talking to your phone to an AI or whatever. So I think it is like a social, like, status quo thing that may or may not shift. The second thing I wanted to kind of talk about, this kind of plays into it, is as far as ChatGPT goes, I think the places we'll see like voice really take off in terms of like the GUI interaction, you kind of touched on it, is with the Googles and the Apples who have control of the entire environment. I know Apple, promised a lot with Siri. I know there's been some delays, and it'll come out eventually kind of to be what they first advertised it to be. But essentially, I think the small disadvantage, I guess, I know obviously ChatGPT has the models and they have the users, but they don't have like their equivalent of a text app. They don't have an equivalent of a FaceTime, of a phone app, of an email. So it is kind of this standalone thing where it would need to be plugged into one of the other platforms. I know obviously Apple had to deal with them for Siri integration and stuff like that. So I feel like until you have control of like the full stack of every app that's included on the iPhone or an Android phone or whatever it might be, it's really hard to fully integrate voice, because other than that, it's really just a conversational thing. There's the whole like demo that they did where it was like a Khan Academy replacement where you could ask for help with your homework and stuff like that. And I think all that's doing is just taking what you would usually type and just turning it into voice. But I think the real power will come when you can be scrolling, trying to text someone, and you literally are like, a thought you would have in your head is, when did I send this text, or where is this picture? And you could literally audibly say it and it'll find it for you based on the context of what you're looking at. Obviously, Chat or OpenAI, I should say, does not have the liberty of that, because although people use it as an operating system, it's not an operating system, and they don't have these apps built in that people use. So I think the Apples and the Googles do have a step up on that, but obviously they are going to have to lean on companies like OpenAI, or at least Apple would, for the time being, it seems, to kind of get their project off the ground a bit faster.
No, I think you make a great point in terms of the companies that own the ecosystems, like Google, like Apple, etc. And then there are the other big ones like Meta, which basically their products are being interacted with by 3 billion people every day. And they're going into these things called smart glasses, which also is another type of operating system in terms of talking and seeing information. Right now, you can't see information on these, but they're allegedly working on versions of that. Google, by the way, just as an example, hinted at a smart glasses product for Google I/O next week, so stay tuned for that. And Apple's supposed to be working on this. So the GUI thing that we're talking about is going to be obviously both on our smartphones, PCs, but also these glasses and other things, wearables, etc. And we've written a lot about this on Substack. We'll put up some representative pieces on the show notes. So, no, I think this is a very interesting area. But Sam goes directly from there to another question that was asked by the audience. And the audience is very smart, by the way. We've got some of the founders of the top startups in America in that audience at Sequoia, because they fund some of the best companies out there in tech and AI land. So these questions themselves are pretty insightful. But there is a question that's coming up next on coding as a vertical versus coding, how OpenAI thinks about it. And I thought we should discuss it given your background in computer science, and particularly because OpenAI just spent $3 billion buying Windsurf, which is one of the leading AI coding companies, competing against companies like Cursor, which just got a valuation of $9 billion. And it's viewed as the leading AI coding company. And it's a very white hot space. So coding as part of all of this and how it evolves into how we interact with AI is an interesting question and discussion. Go ahead, Neal.
For sure.
Similar question about coding. I'm curious, is coding just another vertical application, or is it more central to the future of OpenAI?
That one's more central to the future of OpenAI. Coding, I think, will be how these models kind of... Right now, if you ask ChatGPT a response, you get text back, maybe you get an image. You would like to get a whole program back. You would like, custom rendered code for every response, or at least I would. You would like the ability for these models to go make things happen in the world. And writing code, I think, will be very central to how you actuate the world and call a bunch of APIs or whatever. So I would say coding will be more in a central category. We'll obviously expose it through our API and our platform as well. But ChatGPT should be excellent at writing code.
So right there, coding is something much deeper that is not just for the tens of millions of developers out there, your generation, and et cetera, but also potentially he's hinting for mainstream as well, particularly in a world where anyone who speaks at all mainstream essentially can become a coder in this environment, because we can talk to these systems and they'll literally generate apps code on the fly to meet our requests and queries and prompts. What do you think, Neal?
Yeah, I think it's just kind of a matter of time. I think as Sam touched on, that is kind of everyone's ideal goal in the end, where you'll be able to prompt something. You won't just get a snippet of code in their Canvas environment or whatever. You'll get an entire program. And I think I have played around with Cursor. I've played around with Windsurf, and I think that really is where it's moving. Obviously, OpenAI knows that because they just acquired them. But I think being able to make these really large code-based changes with just a single prompt and not having to actually go through and edit each individual file is kind of where we're moving. And I think even from the aspect of this whole vibe coding thing that's kind of started up in the last couple of months, where people are more worried about the logic of what they're trying to do rather than these specifics. I know the Cursor CEO, I forget his name, but he had an interview recently. I saw some clips on Twitter where he was kind of talking about how he views Cursor as more of a fundamental shift in how programmers are now logic engineers, where they're more focused on the design, whether it's from a conceptual point of view or an actual a UI point of view, to where they will lean on these platforms more, having potentially less technical experience, but having a clear vision of where they want to go. So they'll kind of almost become I know a term that's tossed around a lot in design is a creative director, where you can essentially become a creative director of an app where the aesthetic, the feeling that you want to give. You may not have the technical expertise, but through these platforms, these agentic platforms, you'll be able to kind of just prompt your way to an app that you're happy with, and it'll kind of just output the entire app on one platform.
It sounds like a brave new world, especially when people go back to first principles with this stuff. Because right now what's going on is everyone is just at what I call just adding on to existing ways of doing things, et cetera. And that is in itself creating very interesting ways to use this stuff. But we haven't yet seen the first principles AI native versions of this, and that seems to be coming. And that's what seems to be what is being hinted at. And it also feels like what your peers are going to have to figure out and build for us. We're ready.
Yeah.
So, Neal, please get to work. The last thing I just wanted to touch on is there were a couple of questions at the end in terms of where AI is going over the next couple of years from Sam's point of view. And he had an interesting layout of this, which I thought would be interesting to play and just discuss after that.
At a higher level of detail, I kind of think 2025 will be a year of sort of agents doing work. Coding in particular, I would expect to be a dominant category. I think there'll be a few others too. Next year is a year where I would expect more like a sort of AIs discovering new stuff, and maybe we have AIs make some very large scientific discoveries or assist humans in doing that. And I am kind of a believer that most of the sort of real sustainable economic growth in human history comes from, once you've kind of spread out and colonized the earth, most of it comes from just better scientific knowledge and and then implementing that for the world. And then 27, I would guess, is the year where like that all moves from the sort of intellectual realm to the physical world, and robots go from a curiosity to like a serious economic creator of value. But that was like an off the top of my head kind of guess right now.
So, Neal, give us your thought on this timeline that he's laying out in terms of the roadmap.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. I think the entire interview, obviously you'd have to watch the whole 30 minutes, but the interview was obviously, as everyone else would be in his position, trying to prompt and kind of see what OpenAI's like 5-year, 10-year plan is moving down the future. And this is kind of the first time in the whole thing where Sam kind of just like let his guard down a bit, seemingly, and just kind of obviously it was all kind of he has these thoughts in his head, so it's not any like secret leak or anything that he's given out, but an idea of kind of what he sees as the future. Obviously, I think some of it is like predictable, and some of it I think was a bit interesting that I want to touch on. Obviously, him talking about 25 being the year of agents. We're seeing that obviously with all these agentic platforms, whether it's like your Cursors, your Windsurfs, or just these other standalone platforms. 26 being the year of discovering new things, so kind of making scientific discoveries and research and whatnot in labs. But I think the most interesting one is when he's talking about in 2027, where robots will become like a serious creator of value. There was a part a little earlier in this interview where somebody asked, would he be open to ChatGPT learning like sensor data, whether it's like temperature data and stuff like that.
Great point.
To where it's not only like text and image and what's kind of being scraped off the internet, but these like live feeds of like temperature data and stuff. And how could that be leveraged and used in a way that it's not being done already? And I think that's kind of where the robots come into play, because obviously there's like IR sensors, and you have like your Waymos and all that are kind of already taking all these scans of roads and whatnot. Will there be a way to kind of interface that with like a platform similar to ChatGPT to help not only improve their models but also provide better use to the consumer? I know you had a post on it as well, so I'll just pull that up if people want to go check that out. But yeah, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, this physical AI is a huge area. It's one of the reasons a lot of folks are very excited about not just robots, but self-driving cars and drones and so on. Elon Musk has been running with this in the context of robo-taxis and Optimus robots, etc. I've written a lot about it. This is the most recent piece we did where there was an interesting marathon that it was set up in China where robots ran with humans. As expected, they didn't do as well as the humans, but what they did was fairly impressive, and it's very reminiscent of the early days in the mid-2000s when DARPA sponsored a self-driving contest, and that was the genesis of the self-driving race with the Googles and everything that we see today. It took us a while to get here, but this is how it all starts. If anything, I'm very excited about what Sam is pointing to, the 2-year time frame, but be prepared as someone who's been involved in technology for 30 plus years that this stuff is going to take a bit longer, because it always takes a bit longer. Neal and his peers, they can work hard, but only so much beyond 36 hours a day, even with AI helping them. The last thing I just want to point to is the AI tech stack that we talk about a lot about, and Neal, if you want to put that up, is the one thing that comes across through Sam's presentation is that this company, has been thought about as a large language model AI company, which is box number 3 in the AI tech stack, as I've drawn it out. We've talked about it in all our posts for the last couple of years. And this stack is similar to other tech waves like PC and mobile and internet and all these other things. The differences here are that there are 2 variables that are very different this time. One is box number 4, which is data, which is the stuff that actually drives these models. To Neal, your point on sensor data for physical AI, there's a whole amount of data that has to be created through synthetic means and as computers available that is going to drive all of this development going forward. And then the other aspect are those curves up and down. The top ones being the training curves, pre-training curves, and the bottom ones being the very important inference curves as billions of people use this stuff. And that's what makes these AIs, whether they're large, medium, small, better. And in the legend, there are all these various technical sounding terms. They are technical terms, but these are what's fundamentally changing a lot of the stuff that's talking about. And that's at the depth of the heart of what Sam is talking about at a very high level on this. which we've had a chance to talk about. And this is what young people like Neal and his peers, that's what they're swimming in the deep waters every day. So it's a very exciting time, very exciting world. Neal, I want to thank you for joining us and giving us your perspective. I hope to do a lot more of these with you. I want to thank everyone for joining on this. If you guys have any questions, thoughts, you can hit us up. Our Twitter, X handles are on the screen. We're online. We'll put up our contact in the show notes. As always, we want to do these things better. And we want to thank you for joining us. Subscribe if you care to, like the YouTube videos. That's always appreciated. And as always, stay tuned.